everyone. I'm Congressman Jared Huffman. I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Sean Casten from Illinois. And for the next hour, we're going to have a conversation about climate action. We're going to reflect on a trip we took together a few weeks ago. Sean and I both serve on the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, and we were part of a congressional delegation to the COP26 Climate Summit in Glasgow, Scotland. So we'll talk a bit about that, and we'll take your questions and generally wonk out on the subject of climate change, clean energy, and related matters. I really want to thank the media outlets who are joining us and sharing this program. It's also being live streamed on Twitter, and especially thanks to the constituents of my district and Representative Casten's district for joining us today. I know Sean and I both have very highly engaged, committed constituents that we're honored to represent. And after this brief introduction piece of the event, and I'll hand off to Sean in just a moment, the way this will work is my staff will read aloud questions that we will be receiving through Facebook. Some of those we've received already in advance. Some of them will continue to flow through as we go forward. But to the constituents of Rep. Casten's district in Illinois, I just want to say that you are fortunate to have such a thoughtful, intelligent, and effective representative. I work with a lot of people in the Congress and a lot of folks who are interested in clean energy and climate. And each of them brings, their own set of strengths and skills to the challenge. I sometimes call upon my background as an environmental attorney and a state legislator all the time. But there's no one quite like Sean Casten in the Congress who can tap into this incredible personal experience in developing actual clean energy projects, in understanding how that energy moves, the science of it, technology of it, the business end of it, and to be so eloquent and effective in the advocacy then he applies that experience to is a really unique contribution that we are fortunate to have in this moment. So, Sean, it's great to work with you. I'm going to hand off to you for any opening reflections or remarks, and then we will dive into Q&A.
Well, Jared, you're far too kind, and I can only go downhill from those expectations. So thanks for bussing me up to the top of the mountain. I'm really delighted to be here. I mean, I think all of us are 18 months into COVID, getting a little bit tired of Zoom, but one of the real perks that's come out is the ability to sort of, share with all our folks and colleagues from the other side of the country and all the expertise that you bring, not just your knowledge and your legislative expertise, but a really good sense of humor and a pretty good baritone as well. So done a lot of fun events together. So let me dive in. Climate is why I'm here. I spent 20 years in the clean energy industry before coming to Congress, built some 80 projects, and I'm not going to delve into that except to say that it was my great frustration in the private sector that we always talked about climate wrong. And my sense of both Glasgow and the Build Back Better is that we are finally getting it right. And to be clear, we are still not doing enough, but we're finally getting it right in terms of both the way we're framing our ambitions and how we deal with this internationally and domestically. And when I say we're getting it right and what we've done wrong before, what I mean by that is that we've talked for the last couple decades about climate in the same way we talk about acid rain or particulate pollution or lead in water, which are real issues. But those issues are ones where you have to pay a cost in order to clean up the environment, and then we have to figure out who's going to allocate the payment of that cost. And climate is fundamentally different, because there's this thing that is so obvious to everyone in the private sector, but it's taken a little bit of time to sink in. And Jared told me to say this too many times. But if you don't burn fossil fuel, there's this really cool thing that happens. You don't get billed for fossil fuel. So you actually end up with more money in your pocket. And that creates a different set of problems, but they're real problems. They're not allocation of pain problems, they're allocation of gain problems. And in the private sector, you see it all the time. If you go into a steel mill and you figure out a way for that steel mill to use 30% less metallurgical coke, that means they make more money. it also means that they're sitting there saying, well, what do I do with my staff who are coal handlers and ash handlers? What do I do with the equipment that's now oversized? How do I rejigger my capital budgets? And they're good problems to have, but they're still real problems with real people involved. And so now if we expand that out nationally, there are countries in the world that generate 3 times as many dollars of economic activity for every BTU of energy they use as the United States. And these are countries like Switzerland. Like, they're nice places to live, right? And what that means is that we're on the cusp of the biggest wealth transfer in the history of our species, from energy producers to energy consumers. But it creates all these issues, right? When you move a huge amount of money through the economy, what are the localized impacts on the economy? What are the systemic risks to the system? How do we prioritize the deployment of technologies, not just the preferential acquisition? But if you've got a solar panel, you don't spend a lot of time wondering whether it makes economic sense to run your power plant today. If the sun's shining, you run your power plant. We just got to get it deployed. How do we reimagine our grid as we electrify a bunch of loads? Because when electricity is really cheap, we're going to hugely increase the demand for electricity, which means really rethinking the grid. And how do we elevate the conversation to focus on what's scientifically necessary rather than politically possible? Because, as Winston Churchill said, the time for baffling half measures has come to a close. We've done a lot of that recently. Some things that I've done in the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. We got the BEST Act to put $1.5 billion into deployment of grid energy storage systems. That as we build intermittent renewables on the grid, we've got resources that can absorb and discharge energy. $1.5 billion isn't enough, but it's the first time we've really done that. We've set up a whole new agency in the Department of Energy to decarbonize the hard to decarbonize sectors, because we got to figure out scientifically, how are we going to make cement? How are we going to make fertilizer? How are we going to make steel? Those are research projects, and we've got to do the research because we're out of time. We've done some really good things in the Build Back Better. We need the Senate to pass it. But 2 of the ones that I think are really important on that deployment side, one is we've created refundability. So for the first time, if you build a solar panel, if you buy an electric vehicle, if you put in an electric vehicle charger, if you insulate your home, your incentive isn't limited to whether or not you have tax liability and can take a tax credit. You actually will get a direct check for that from the government. And it costs the government the same, but it makes sure that people can use it who don't necessarily have tax liability. We've also made some tweaks to the Loan Program Office, which is the part of DOE that gave a loan to this little company called Tesla. You may have heard of them and got them off the ground. We got a whole bunch of those other companies that are now coming out. We made some tweaks to make it easier for that credit to go out the door to get these technologies deployed. There's a lot of things we didn't do. We'd still like to get done. I've got a Climate Financial Risk Act to deal with some of the stresses in our financial system. I've done a lot of work with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, because as we deploy all this clean energy, the price of energy falls, and that actually reduces the incentive to build new assets. That's a market structure question, but we're going the right path. Now, how that relates to Glasgow. In Glasgow, I think one of the biggest things that came out was this global methane pledge, and that was very much informed by both the science and the need. The methane is 80 times as potent a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. The amount of methane that was pledged to reduce is the equivalent, Jared, correct me if I'm wrong, every ship, bus, airplane, truck, taking it all off the road. And we have to do it scientifically, because there's this weird thing that happens that when you burn fossil fuel, you also make a lot of soot. And that soot is actually a temporary cooling chemical. Well, methane is a temporary heating chemical. So as we get rid of these things that are long-term, we got to get rid of the CO2, but as we get rid of that soot, we also need to get rid of the temporary heating chemicals. And so that methane pledge is a really, really big deal. Globally, there's a lot of commitment to stop subsidizing fossil fuel. Huge. US, we're still kind of at a third grade reading level on this issue, but it's a huge thing, because if we're going to deploy clean energy, let's stop subsidizing dirty energy. There was a global pledge to get a lot of that out of the way, pledge to stop financing new coal plants, really, really critical. And one of the things that I thought was really, really interesting when we were out there, in the US, we can get bipartisan support to build levees around New Orleans and protect them from the next flood, as we should. We can't get bipartisan support to change the industries of New Orleans that release all that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. That's a very partisan issue. And one of the things that we heard in Glasgow was that US banks who were there, trillions, hundreds of trillions of dollars of money was there in the room. And the developing world was saying, your banks want to invest in put all their money into mitigation, not adaptation. In other words, our private sector is going to India and saying, I'd love to invest in solar farms in India, but I can't quite make money building seawalls around Bangladesh. The developing world would like us to do both of those, but it was almost this perfect inversion of where in the United States, we get political will to do, the joke I've been telling people is that if you got somebody hit you on the head with a hammer every day, what would you rather have? Take away hammers or investments in helmet technology? In the US, we invest in helmet technology, and meanwhile, our private sector is investing in taking hammers away. So I thought that was really positive. And I got to stress, we are not done. If all of the pledges at Glasgow will drop the temperature to only 1.8 degrees of warming, and we cannot exceed 1.5. All of the actions in the Build Back Better will cut CO2 emissions by mid-century by 40 to 50%. That's a really big deal. Both of those pledges will be the biggest things we have ever done to reduce CO2, but they aren't enough. So celebrate the first down, maybe celebrate the second first down, but we're not in the end zone yet, so let's not start dancing just yet. So that's a big overview. I look forward to the questions, and let me now hand it off to my good friend, Mr. Huffman.
Well, thank you, Sean. You have helped us to dive right into the deep end of the pool. We are going to be touching on some really important and consequential issues, many of them very complex. But before we go too far into the particulars, I know Build Back Better Act is going to be something we come back to again and again in this conversation. Let's reflect a little bit about COP26 in Scotland. And we'll bring other questions into the conversation in a bit, but I wanted to just free associate with you for a little while if we could. You talked about loss and damage, the fact that the developing world kind of looks at this problem and is maybe skeptical of the ability of the United States and the European Union and other big emitters to adequately solve the mitigation problem. Meanwhile, some of their countries are on the verge of disappearing. And so they're pretty understandably focused on adaptation and whether they're going to be able to survive, and whether the big developed countries that have pretty much caused this crisis are going to address the equity of that. That came through to me pretty profoundly at COP26. And we as the developed countries were outnumbered by other countries that kind of have that perspective. Did you have the same sense?
Yeah, I mean, what was it? When we got there, I think Biden had committed to $5.7 billion to that fund, and then doubled it again. And we came in thinking like, yeah, we're the United States, like we're putting $20 billion into this. And then we had the developing world say, well, on a relative to your GDP, that's about a half or 25% of what Germany's doing. And you realize like there are real needs there, and sometimes we shouldn't pat ourselves on the back too hard just yet, right?
Yeah, totally. There's been some reporting that fossil fuel interests and representatives at COP26 vastly outnumbered these delegations from governments and environmental advocates and others. They didn't wear tags that said, "Hi, my name is Joe and I'm from the fossil fuel industry." But I think by all accounts, the fossil fuel industry was there in force. What is your sense of what we're up against when we talk about fundamentally changing course globally away from this golden goose that has become the wealthiest industry in the history of the world? You talked about, what it does to our GDP relative to Switzerland in your opening remarks. How realistic is it to think that in this decade, we're going to fundamentally change course to the way the entire world powers the economy?
I want to try not to sound too much like a Boy Scout, Jared, but can you name a major social movement in our history that ever was led from the top down, right? I think these things get led from the bottom up because at the senior government level, or even at our mid-level government level where you and I sit, the people who have a lot to lose are hyper present because they know what they have to lose. the folks who are going to be the entrepreneurs of tomorrow, the folks who are going to benefit from having access to cheaper energy. And make no mistake, like the fossil fuel industry does not benefit from lowering the cost of energy, right? Yeah, and that's not to knock them, right? I mean, it's the
What
sort
they
of
do.
business 101. Like how much do you want for that pair of
Yep.
shoes? Have it $1 million? No. Would you take 900,000? Like, I don't start with the low price, right? But the people who benefit from that transition won't be there. But I was really struck. I mean, you and I were both in Madrid as well. I heard a lot more conversation in Glasgow about we have to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. We have to no longer fund coal plants. Like we're not winning fast enough, but I think we're winning. Didn't you
Yeah.
get that same sense?
Definitely. Well, it's the first time fossil fuels were called out, albeit timidly, but called out as something that pretty much the entire world agreed upon. But we also saw the presence of the fossil fuel industry in more subtle ways. We continue to see this in Congress all the time. The fake climate solutions that are basically wrapped as environmentally friendly, innovative ways to reduce emissions, but they happen to involve increasing the amount of extraction and burning of fossil fuels in the decades to come, rather than fundamentally getting off fossil fuels. You and I have been some of the loudest critics of some of these fake climate solutions, carbon capture, utilization, and storage being, one of the biggest. And, Exxon and Chevron and others are continuing to run glossy ads in publications. We see big billboards at the Washington airports when you fly into town to make you feel so good about what American fossil fuel companies are doing to lower emissions. Talk a little bit about the reality of some of these things and why we just don't have time to place our bets on fake climate solutions for the fossil fuel industry.
Well, how do I put this nicely? If a member, let's just imagine one of our members, Jared. Let's stretch our brains here. Try to imagine a member of Congress who's completely beholden to the fossil fuel sector. And I know that's like a fantasy land, but just try to imagine one in your head.
It's a long list.
If they said the only way that I'll get on board with this crazy Huffman Casten agenda is if you agree to spend $20 billion building a unicorn factory, I'd sign on to that, because you and I both know that unicorns aren't real. and that's why I said at the start that this is a deployment problem, right? Because there is no one in the private sector who wants to build a CCS plant, because the basic economic proposition of a coal plant with carbon capture and storage is that you're going to take a power generation plant that already can't compete with solar, with wind, can't compete with natural gas, can't compete with anything. And you're going to make it more expensive to build and also more expensive to operate. Like, that investment's just never going to get done. If people believe that it's going to happen and we need to fund R&D for it, it's a unicorn factory. But I think the reason why I said deployment matters so much is, like, it's a big deal that in the last quarter, 10% of all vehicles sold in the United States were electric vehicles. Because once you have an electric vehicle, if you got an EV in your garage, and you've also got a Dodge Dart in your garage, one of them's a lot cheaper to operate and has better acceleration, right? We're seeing this surge in solar deployment, and the coal industry is dying, not because of mandates, but because it isn't economic, right? All these cheaper sources come on. So I think as long as we keep focusing on deployment, we're going to get there. And if I'm the Chevron CEO, I'm probably having board meetings saying my value proposition is giving people access to hot water and electric light. My value proposition is not giving people access to something they can burn, right? And I think as they'll pivot their business models eventually. They're smart people, but we're beating them on economics.
Yeah,
Not fast
not
enough.
pivoting yet. I think they still are in a bit of denial about their ability to continue that burning of fossil fuel model for decades to come.
Yeah,
But
I don't
I
mean
hear
to be
you saying,
Pollyannish about it. I'm just more optimistic than I was 10 years ago.
yeah,
Just because of the rate of deployment of all these cheaper and cleaner technologies.
And what I hear you saying is that, if we have to make some of the tax credits and other incentives accessible to what we know to be, fake solutions, we can do that as long as we're not waiting on the clean energy pieces. If it's all going forward together, the economics and other benefits of the clean energy pieces are going to win the day. Is that fair?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, you and I have talked about this before. We got to be vigilant against unintended consequences. This Build Back Better, biggest climate bill that's going to ever be passed by the Congress, has $550 billion spread over 10 years in clean energy. The IMF has calculated that the United States today subsidizes the fossil fuel sector by $650 billion every year. So even if we made the Build Back Better, and we got all these people saying this is too big, it's going to be hard for the economy. If we made it 10 times bigger, we still would be subsidizing the fossil fuel industry more than we subsidize the clean energy industry. I forget if this was someone on our committee, someone said to me the other day that government shouldn't pick winners and losers, but if you're going to, at least don't pick the losers.
Yep. Last question about the conference before we dive into questions from Facebook. We've got the Build Back Better Act hanging in the balance. We hope it's going to pass this month out of the Senate and get to the president's desk. When we were in Glasgow, it felt like the whole world was looking at the United States and wondering, are they for real? Will they do things that are durable? Or is this just kind of a new PR tour and the pendulum will swing back after the next election? How important is it that we actually pass this legislation that is going to set things in motion and make more clean energy investments than anything the world has ever seen in ways that can't just be undone, by the midterm election? How important is that to where the world goes on this issue?
I mean, look, as you and I both know, we're out of time scientifically, right? If we stopped emitting all CO2 today, we've already got 2 feet of sea level rise baked into the system, probably by mid-century. That's a disaster for Miami Beach. It's a disaster for Baltimore. It's a disaster for Louisiana south of I-10. We do not have the choice to delay. So yeah, we've got to get it done. The sense that I got and what, I sort of felt sad because on the one hand, the world was so happy that we were there. They were so happy that we were back in the Paris Accord. They were so impressed with John Kerry's and all his proficiency as envoy. And yet, the questions we got at the press conferences was, well, what's going to happen with Senator Manchin, dude? Will you get rid of the filibuster? What happens if you take control? We know your last president pulled out of Paris. We know the president before the one before that one pulled out of Kyoto. And you just get this sense that like they want us to lead, but in the meantime, they have to go ahead. I was saying to my wife when I got home that I almost feel like the rest of the world talks to the US about climate change the way we talk to Saudi Arabia about whether or not women should drive. Like it's this thing that like it's like they sort of view us as being so bizarre and such an outlier and something that normal people wouldn't do. And we're just going to have to like park that over to a corner because there are other things we really like about you, but that was really weird. And it just felt like an outlier, right? And so I'd like us to be leading. I think we're good at leading, but they're watching our feet right now, not our lips. Yeah. Don't you think?
I think so. Absolutely. One last reflection on Glasgow. The young people are one of the things that gives me hope. That conference was just chock full of young people, of people of color. It was so diverse and so energized. And one member of our delegation is kind of a rock star to that whole generation around the planet. Didn't you find it impressive the way everywhere we went, AOC was recognized and there was a sort of a throng around her at all times. And, she was just incredibly gracious and patient with every single person that was there to sing her praises. But it speaks to, the kind of new energy and diverse energy that is coming along, I think, in this climate movement.
And therefore, I thought you were talking about the throngs around Alan Lowenthal, but you're right.
I hope he's not watching.
Yeah, it was amazing. Like, I mean, I ended up, I'm sure you did as well. There was one point where I said, do you ever miss your anonymity? Like that you can fly across an ocean and sit down and I think Speaker Pelosi got through rooms more unmolested than she did, and was always gracious about it. But folks are energized, right?
Yeah.
That's what I said before. Like these big movements tend to come from the ground up, not the top down. And there's a groundswell out there.
Yeah.
It's inspiring.
Yeah. I jokingly told her she was climate Jesus, and it was only half joking because it's profound, the following that she has among young people and lots of communities. So let's go to some questions. I think my team has a few teed up, and they're going to feed them into us, and we'll just free associate from there.
Okay, great. So the first question is from Dana Utman, and he wants to know, or she wants to know, what about building a climate change civilian corps like CCC in the 1930s? Isn't climate change an emergency that should be addressed immediately and as strongly as possible?
Yeah, so that takes us right to the Build Back Better Act, because the Civilian Climate Corps, and this is a bill that I led in the House with our colleague Joe Neguse of Colorado. But that Civilian Climate Corps made it into the Build Back Better Act, passed out of the House, and it would be a good old-fashioned WPA style program to deploy thousands and thousands of people around the country to help meet this crisis. I will tell you that it has its critics. I'm not sure how Senator Manchin feels about it, but I've heard some in the Senate, feel like in a full employment economy, maybe this is one piece of the package that might not make the cut. But I tend to agree with the spirit of the question. This is something long-term that I think we need. And in fact, some states have begun to do this on their own. California's got something very much like this, and I know several other states do as well. Sean, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree, and I will. I'm glad we have you leading on this. I have not been as focused on this issue, but I'd be a little bit dismissive of the full employment question, because if you look at the transition we're going to go through, yes, we are creating a ton of construction jobs, but ask yourself how many people you need to operate a solar farm, how many people need to operate a wind farm. If you have an electric vehicle, when's the last time you took it to the shop for maintenance? And that's a huge boost in labor productivity. We're going to generate a lot more wealth with a lot fewer labor hours, but there still is a dignity of work, right? And there still are good things that need to get done. And I think this is an opportunity to help pivot some of that employment over to the things that we need going forward.
Yeah, there's also going to be some dislocation and some career changing as we go through this transition. And this program would be, I think, responsive to that, help us ensure a smooth and equitable transition. Let's go to the next question.
Okay, I'm going to combine two questions on electric vehicles. Marianne Bennett wants to know, is someone working on electric cars that most people can afford to maintain? For example, will we soon see cars that can, when one battery cell goes out, the whole very expensive battery has to be replaced? And who's funding that research? And secondly, Isla Meadows wants to know, how exactly is our infrastructure going to support all these electric vehicles?
Sean, you want to start us off on that?
Sure. So the electric vehicles have come so far, so fast. People are buying these with the full expectation that you don't have to get the maintenance for 100,000 miles. So you're going to have a lot less expense and operating costs with an electric vehicle than you do with a gas engine, because you don't have a transmission to repair. You don't have a fuel supply system to repair. You don't have all these moving parts that rub against each other. So I'm pretty sanguine on that question. Obviously, we need to deal with battery recycling and work through those issues, but there's just a lot less material that goes into building and running an electric car, because the material that goes into a gasoline car is, yeah, it's the steel, but it's also all that gasoline, right, that you're using all the time. With respect to the build out of the infrastructure, it's a really, really important question. The amount of energy we use right now for transportation in the United States is to a first approximation about the same as the amount of energy we use for power generation. So if you start thinking about electrifying a significant chunk of our transportation fleet, you need to think about probably building, and Secretary Granholm her estimate is that we need to build as much generation in the country as we have now, and need to build it in the next 10 years. And we're also going to need to make sure that we build it in the right places, but then build the wires because we're putting generation in different places where the renewable resources are. And we're putting load in different places, and we got to build a lot of transmission to do that. That is contemplated in the Build Back Better. There's a lot of money to build out that generation. It's not enough. But I think the hope and some of the conversations we've had with Gina McCarthy and others is that there's enough federal money in there to catalyze so that the private sector it carries it along and amplifies that and leverages it. But we'll be back to that well before the decade's out, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I agree. So one of the things that's actually in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, we've been talking mainly about the Build Back Better, but the more traditional infrastructure focused piece of legislation that was signed into law last month by President Biden, it's not all great. There are pieces of that bill that I didn't like, and Sean, probably the same would apply to you. But one of the things it got right is a major multi-billion-dollar investment in upgrading and modernizing the grid, which for the reasons you just explained is essential to making all this work. The reason we got to now finish the job and pass Build Back Better is because having a shiny new grid is great, but if it's moving dirty electrons, we're not tackling the climate crisis. So these two things, I think, go hand in glove together. And on the EV technology and the consumer side of things, I too am less worried about the battery reliability. But the one piece I am concerned about that we haven't yet addressed, we're going to have to do it going forward, is the reliability of the charging infrastructure. Tesla has a state-of-the-art, incredible charging infrastructure, but it's proprietary right now. We're going to need to get them to open that up to other EV users. But we're also going to need to make sure that this patchwork of other charging stations, some high speed, some not, some reliable, some broken, some inaccessible, it's just got to be much, much better because we want it to be a good user experience as millions of people begin to buy EVs and replace internal combustion engines. Right now, as an EV owner and driver, I can tell you that the charging piece is a little bit spotty. And you learn where the good charging is and where it's not, but you learn by trial and error, and we need to do better on that score.
Can I just add something quick on that? And I'm glad you brought up the bipartisan infrastructure bill. There's and I'm going to get this number wrong, but I want to say it was about $70 billion in there specifically for EV charging, but it's primarily
7.5.
Okay, but it's primarily based on building charging out along our highways, where all the gas stations are, where you think about charging. It's really, really important. And it needs to be with these standards that Congressman Huffman's talking about. What was not in that bipartisan bill was, where do you put chargers for people who rent? Where do you put chargers? I'm an AV owner as well, and I have a garage, and I put a charger in my garage, and I don't really need to use the supercharger network that much because most of my trips I'm not filling up in between. And so in the Build Back Better, we've tried to make sure that we also have money to put that into urban areas, into places where if you rent and you don't have an attached garage, you still have a place that you can park and fill up. And we got to do both of those. And they do fit together sort of as a hand in glove between those two pieces.
Yeah, that equity piece is huge for renters. So thanks for bringing that up. And I'll just add one more thing that's in Build Back Better that kind of responds to this. The Postal Service. We have the largest civilian fleet in the world. If you've seen the vehicles they drive around in, they're a disgrace. They are gas guzzlers. They explode. The brakes don't work. They're unsafe. And we've got to completely replace that fleet. The current Postmaster General wanted to do it with internal combustion engines. So we would go from the most embarrassing largest civilian fleet in the world to the last internal combustion fleet probably on the road 10, 20 years from now. But in the Build Back Better, we set a different course to fully electrify the Postal Service fleet. It's about 200,000 delivery vehicles, and to put charging infrastructure in every single postal facility in America. So obviously we want to make this charging infrastructure ubiquitous for people that may not be homeowners. Having charging opportunities at every postal facility can be part of meeting that need too.
Okay, Clint Wilder has a question also about EVs. Batteries for EVs and energy storage require minerals like lithium and cobalt. How can we bring that mining back to the United States from places like China and the Congo and ensure that it's mined responsibly here? Don Streeper from Santa Rosa has similar concerns that he supports electrical vehicles and its development, but what about the price to the environment? How do we do it safely?
Thanks for that question, Clint. I'll start us off and then hand off to Sean. So totally true. Right now, we are not producing and certainly not refining and manufacturing at the level we need to be domestically here in the US. China has pretty much cornered that market. And it's not that the lithium and cobalt comes from China. It doesn't. In fact, if you look at the resources that they have, they're not even one of the top 5 countries in the world when it comes to those resources. The United States actually does have a lot of those resources, and a lot of other friendly countries that we can trust and work with have those resources. But an awful lot of it is coming from the Congo, and some of the standards there are totally not acceptable. So I think we've just got to confront that head on. We are beginning to do that here in the United States, not quickly enough, not aggressively enough, but the Salton Sea here in California is a place where we can produce an awful lot of lithium. Doesn't have to be environmentally destructive. It can come right out of the brine from the Salton Sea. We have other opportunities in Nevada and other places in the US, and we actually have quite a bit of cobalt in the United States and in Canada as well. So we're going to need to find ways to source a lot of that here, and then we have to refine it here. And that's in some cases the tricky part. It's kind of a dirty process to refine these things. And, there can be a race to the bottom where we outsource the dirtier parts of that to developing countries and other places or China. We got to find ways to set a very high standard. I think do a lot more of that here in the United States. And that requires, some tough conversations amongst ourselves, with our friends in the environmental community. The bigger picture of the climate crisis, I think, demands that we step up and get that done, though. Sean?
Only a couple things to add. The first is, I remember as a young biochemistry major, I had a professor who said to me that one of the lessons in medicine is that everything is poisonous at the right dosage. And I think it's important to keep in mind that there's no way that we meet our energy needs without some consequences. And as Jared said, we want to make sure that we minimize those consequences and don't just export them. Yeah. At the same point, I'm somewhat sanguine on the question, because we are fundamentally moving to a much less resource intensive society. In this transition, we don't think about that. We want to make sure we mine all the iron that's in the steel in our cars in the US in Minnesota, right? We care about, where the steel manufacturing jobs, where the auto manufacturing jobs, and we care that those things are mined responsibly. But once we build that car in the US, most of the actual mining and environmental destruction from that car is all that gasoline you buy every day, right? It's not, the life cycle environmental consequences of that car has much more to do with the use than the manufacture. And so now, as we shift to a vehicle that, yes, has rare earth metals, and we need to be responsible about that, but it needs it to build it. And now, if it's then getting its electricity from a fuel source that's clean and renewable, where, yes, there's still consequences, but it's a much smaller resource footprint on the overall system. So we're moving in the right direction.
And it's going to get better, right? I mean, the current state of the art on battery technology is not where this story ends. A decade, 2 decades from now, we're going to have greater energy density. We're going to have better, smarter material strategies. But I guess the last thing I would add on this, you sometimes hear this this talking point from those who are opposed to clean energy. Oh, we don't want to mine the Grand Canyon, and you'd have to open up all these sensitive areas to do all of this destructive mining. You really don't. We have sources of lithium and cobalt and other rare earths that can meet the demand, certainly for the next decade or more. And we're going to begin recycling about 30% of those batteries. That can meet about 30% of the demand once we get this industry up and running. So you don't have to trade away the Grand Canyon or the Boundary Waters or other sensitive places. We can do this. Next question.
So William Brown wants to know, can hydrogen-based transportation be made feasible?
Sean, what do you think? I'm skeptical.
Oh, here I go. So I'm a bit of a hydrogen crank, and I'm a hydrogen crank because 20 years ago I was on the hydrogen technical advisory panel for the Department of Energy and was completely convinced that hydrogen was going to be the fuel of the future and we should invest in it, and was working on codes and standards development. And I still think hydrogen is going to play a really important role in certain manufacturing operations. You know, how are we going to, we don't know how to take iron oxide and reduce it to pure iron in a steel mill without using coal, but we could do that with hydrogen, right? So there's some chemical uses that I think it could take up. But what's happened in the last 20 years is there's really been virtually no meaningful advances in hydrogen storage technology. And so if we're going to make sustainable hydrogen coming from renewable energy and going through electrolyzers, you're going through this process where you're taking renewable electricity, converting that into hydrogen, compressing, storing, liquefying, moving that hydrogen to another location so that it can go into a fuel cell and then be converted back into electricity. And the question is, if I'm taking electricity to make electricity, why go through all those intermediate conversion steps? And the reason to do that is if it's cheaper, more efficient, more cost effective to move hydrogen than it is to move electricity. And I mean, you were talking about the battery technology will improve. 20 years ago, if you had an electric vehicle, it was lead acid batteries, right? Maybe nickel metal hydride. Now we've got lithium ion and all these advances. 20 years ago, if you had a hydrogen fueled vehicle, it was a high pressure compressed tank. And if you have a hydrogen fueled vehicle today, it's a high pressure compressed tank. And so from a round trip efficiency perspective, if I take electricity, put it in a battery and take it back out, I'm maybe 80% round trip efficiency. If I take electricity, put it through an electrolyzer, make hydrogen, compress the hydrogen, take it back, run it through a fuel cell, and maybe 40% round trip efficiency. So just from a resource intensivity use, I have a hard time, absent some, as yet unknown breakthrough in hydrogen storage technology, seeing it be a major player. Now, if you talk to, Toyota's continues to make a bet on fuel cell vehicles, and I could be wrong. But my view is that I'm hard pressed to see hydrogen being a significant part of as sort of an energy transfer mechanism in the future.
Yeah, and Sean just gave a fairly Elon Musk-like explication of why hydrogen loses head-to-head against battery electric technology, at least for most applications, and I totally agree with that. But what he didn't mention is that a lot of the hydrogen that is being promoted right now is not even clean. It's coming from fossil fuels. So it's like the worst of all those inefficiencies, and you've got fossil fuel burning on the front end to create it. And we just, that can't be the answer to this crisis. Next question.
Okay, Eric Thies is asking, like me, many people have seen climate change since the 1980s. As a scientist, I see that money has become so powerful in the US government that there's little hope for rational democracy, despite the likelihood of the existential catastrophe. How can you reduce that influence that fossil fuel money has put on policy?
Yeah, I'll start us off here. I mean, of course, there's special interest influence throughout our political system. It's a big problem. It's a real problem. And the Supreme Court has made it much harder to dial down the influence of big money in politics. It's not going to be just the fossil fuel industry. It's their proxies and everyone else who is buying favors at every step in our political process. We could talk about Citizens United and a constitutional amendment. I'm going to support all of that. We've got a wonderful piece of legislation that's passed the House and is sitting in the Senate waiting for Joe Manchin to get over his fixation with the filibuster. But the bottom line is those things are long shots in our current political climate. We're not going to have a new Supreme Court for a while. So the best thing that you and everyone else can do is just elect people that are not subject to that kind of corrupting influence. Elect people that will go and call the balls and strikes in Congress independently and in other political positions. Sean, you got any thoughts?
Well, you've taken exactly what I said, what I was going to say about, elect good people and do. We had a lot of problems in our electoral system. We have a lot of sort of structural things we're trying to fix in our democracy, but don't be demoralized because we do have a lot of pretty great, pretty ethical colleagues, right? Not 100% of them, but there are a lot of people who are in this for the right reasons. And our founders created a form of government where they basically didn't trust Jared and I to pick who's going to be in government. They trusted you all. So be an educated voter and go through. The other thing that I'd add to amplify that point is we solve great problems in America not by sitting on our hands and waiting for 435 or 535 people in Washington to fix them. We solve great problems by getting organized, right? And so because this is a technology deployment problem, go get some technology. If you've got the financial wherewithal, buy an electric vehicle, insulate your home, put some solar panels on the roof. If you don't have the wherewithal to do that, well, maybe, figure out what organizations you belong to. Maybe it's your church or your temple or your mosque. Maybe you're in a Boy Scout troop that can go do this. Maybe it's the business you work for. Because all of those groups, by deploying these resources, you're going to suddenly find yourself with energy that's cheaper and cleaner. And there is no better way to take on the fossil fuel industry than to take away their revenue source, right? Because once you're keeping and Amory Lovin's great line that, all people really want is a hot shower and a cold beer. And if your shower's hot and your beer's cold and you don't have a natural gas bill, you're a pretty happy camper, right?
Yeah. That's why electric vehicles, in my opinion, are so important, because if you want to take away the revenue source for the fossil fuel industry, the one place where they still got us by the short hairs, because we don't have a lot of alternatives, is transportation. It's now the top emitting sector. And although we're making progress, right now it's almost entirely driven by fossil fuel. So that's why there is so much emphasis on, and so many huge investments in the Build Back Better Act on rapidly transitioning away from fossil fuel by jumpstarting electrification of the transportation sector. It's just a huge part of this. Hey, before we go to the next question, though, Sean, your response just now raised a question in my mind. John Kerry walked into a little bit of trouble a few days ago because he was giving a speech where, he talked about the huge difference that the private sector can make in battling the climate crisis. And a lot of people thought that what he was really doing is offering an excuse not to legislate and, do the rulemaking and other things that our national government can do. He clarified after that no, that it's additive. We got to do the legislation, we got to do the rulemaking, and we got to harness the power of the private sector. But what are your thoughts about, private capital working in conjunction with good policy and the right mix of those things?
So I am, I am a firm believer that the private sector can deploy capital better than any of us in government can. But at the same time, they do not deploy capital for moral reasons. They don't deploy capital for immoral reasons. They deploy capital for profit-seeking reasons. And so what we have an obligation to do on the policy side is to make sure the things we want to achieve as a society are aligned with where their profits are. That means, if we want to generate a huge amount of wealth for every American and accelerate the deployment of all those clean energy deployments in the private sector, let's just stop subsidizing fossil fuels. You as taxpayers will have a lot more money in your pockets because we won't have to tax you as much. Won't be wasting all that money. And oh, by the way, all of a sudden there won't be these distortions in our private markets affecting how the private sector is deploying capital. And we've seen that at moments in our history when we brought market pressure to the power sector and started deregulating in 1992. Within 10 years, the price of power fell 6%, and the CO2 emissions from the power sector fell from 1,300 pounds a megawatt hour to 900 pounds a megawatt hour. Not because the private sector was sitting there saying, all of a sudden I really care about climate. And, and certainly we know from power deregulation, you had some hiccups in California, right? There were some scandals around that. But once the rules were changed to say, we just want you to preferentially run your lowest cost assets, that was the beginning of the end of the coal industry, because the coal industry can only operate if they are deeply, deeply subsidized.
We don't
Right.
talk enough about taking away the subsidies for fossil fuel, but we also need to be clear-eyed about how much opposition to that entitlement we're going to face. Sean, you're not on the Natural Resources Committee, but we had a hearing earlier, actually last month, on the smallest of baby steps. You know, we haven't increased the royalties that we charge for fossil fuel extraction on public lands in a century. It has been a giveaway. It's practically giving away public assets for free. And we talked about putting some royalties in place that are commensurate with what these same companies pay when they develop on private land. And you would have thought it was the end of the world. Our Republican colleagues just went crazy as if we were ceding all this geopolitical advantage to Putin and shooting ourselves in the foot economically. There was an enormous hue and cry about it, but that was just a baby step. That was just these tiny little royalty reforms on our public lands. When we talk about the rest of the subsidies that are littered throughout the tax code, we're just going to have enormous opposition and resistance, and we probably better brace for that.
Yeah, and it's not just the tax code. There was a number of years ago when Massachusetts was trying to shut down what they called the Filthy Five. It was 5 coal plants in Massachusetts, and the Harvard School of Public Health went and looked at what was the statistically significant differential rate in asthma and premature fatality downwind of those 5 plants. And then what did that cost our healthcare system? And if you divide that number by the megawatt hours of those plants, it worked out to, depending on what you think is the actuarial value of a human life, somewhere between $30 and $50 per megawatt hour. Now, that may not mean much to you, but the total revenues of the coal industry are somewhere between $30 and $50 a megawatt hour. So implicitly in that math was that the coal-fired power industry in this country is getting 100% subsidy of their revenues from Medicaid, right? If you think about who's hurting, who lives downwind of coal plants, these are huge, huge subsidies. And take the earlier question, we're sitting here having a really good conversation of, if you're going to be manufacturing lithium-ion batteries, how are we going to make sure that you are going to be responsible for the long-term disposal costs? If you build a nuclear plant, what do you pay for the insurance for your long-term disposal costs? And yet the coal industry just gets to park it all in the health system.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Next question.
Okay, I'm hoping we can squeeze in about 2 more questions here. So Rich Farrington's asked one on Facebook Live, but he also sent in the same question in shorter format. It is killing of as many as 14,237 large giant sequoias in the last 2 years by towering megafires is an emergency. What can be done to prevent any more from being killed? Why doesn't the House Resources Committee have a hearing to determine what science-based actions are needed to protect any more of our priceless heritage from being killed?
Yeah. So I'll tackle that. We have had some hearings on the challenges that these catastrophic wildfires are already presenting on our public lands, not just with the giant sequoias in California, but it's a huge issue. And there is no simple solution. We've got folks that are proposing backcountry clear-cut logging as the answer, and that is not the answer. That is not going to save the giant sequoias. It's not going to keep communities safer from wildfire, and in fact could be a distraction of resources away from things that will keep both things like the giant sequoias, but also populated areas where we got to focus our protective efforts, where we got to have more safety. So shaded fuel breaks, controlled burns are the most obvious and essential tool in the toolbox. Some selective logging, absolutely. All of these are tools that we're trying to deploy. And there are more resources being put to it than ever before at both the federal and the state level. The challenge is we are making up for decades of not doing these things. And so fuel loads have built up. And as we do that, the conditions on the ground have gotten a lot worse because of climate change. Things are drier and hotter, and these conditions are just the perfect storm for the kind of fires we've seen and the kind of damage that we're grappling with. So that's a long-winded answer to your question. I'm concerned about not just giant sequoias, but populated areas all over the Western United States. And I want to see us targeting our interventions in the most thoughtful, strategic way. That, I believe, is going to be at the wildland-urban interface, where shaded fuel breaks, controlled burns, and thoughtfully constructed timber harvest plans can do the most good. Sean?
As the guy who's not on the Natural Resources Committee and lives
The
in
guy from
Chicago,
Illinois?
where we have neither redwoods nor wildfires, I'm going to leave that one to your expertise, Jerry.
All right. All right, what's
Okay.
next, Jenny?
All right, so we're just about at time, but there's two really good questions here. So I think I'm going to ask them together and you guys can decide what you want to answer. So Lisa Samrin wants to know, how can we make progress on the climate as long as the GOP is dealing in bad faith? I mean, to be honest, I don't think the Build Back Better Act will get signed into law. And if that's the case, what's plan B? And the other really good question you guys could also end on is of Arthur and Janet Hasten, Sebastopol asked, of all the issues concerning the variables which contribute to climate change, which one, in your opinion, do you believe to be the most important issue to realistically achieve the greatest progress?
Of all the issues, what's the most important?
Yep. And what happens? What's plan B if this thing doesn't pass?
Okay, well, I'm going to start us off and let Sean Beck clean up. First of all, I wouldn't think of the Build Back Better Act as plan A, as if like it's going to solve the problem and everything else would just be fallbacks. Build Back Better Act is really profoundly important. We've talked about some of the reasons why that is, but it's not nearly enough. We are going to have to do, I mean, quite honestly, the answer is everything possible that we can this decade in order to meet this crisis. So there's no plan B, in terms of that framework. If there's more that states can be doing, local communities, individuals, private sector actors, don't sit around and wait for whether we pass the Build Back Better Act. Get moving on those things. We need those too. And we'll try to pass the Build Back Better Act. And when we do, I think we will actually, we won't be done. And we will not spike the football, take victory laps. We will get right to work on all the other additional things that we have to do. And then just to answer the second question, as I understood it, what's the most important thing? What's the most important missing ingredient to solving this climate crisis? I would say political will. I think it's as simple as that. Sean?
Yeah, the only thing that we're constrained by is ambition. We have the technology, we have the talents, we have the capital. We don't have the time. We just need the ambition. But I think I want to sort of end where I started, and I don't want to be Pollyannish, but we are making the transition to clean energy whether you like it or not. The private sector is really good at cost cutting, and as they discover that one of the costs they can cut is this huge line item on their budget for energy, they're going to cut those costs. And we're already seeing that. We're seeing huge surges in people building out efficiency. There's a reason why the single biggest growth in employment, we're adding way more green jobs than brown jobs, and they are primarily in the energy efficiency space because people like saving money, right? The challenge that we have is that, number one, because of all these subsidies we talked about, it's not happening fast enough. Well, we can fix that legislatively. The second challenge we have, and we've got to confront this, and it's a little bit of a hard conversation, is that this is going to be so dislocating for so many people. There are parts of the country, Illinois 20 years ago was a coal state. Illinois is now a wind and a solar state, and we've got electric vehicle manufacturing coming here, and we are winning the future, as the saying goes. The West Virginia is a coal state. Whatever you think of Mr. Manchin, you cannot fault someone in West Virginia for saying, when you automated mining, you did not look out for me. You looked out for mine owners. Why should I think that this next transition that's going to allow people to get their energy with less labor input is going to look out for me either? And what's going to happen to my local economy? And I think we have to think about, just transition gets thrown around, and sometimes it sounds a little bit woke, but there is the reality of, one can embrace the steam engine and still have great sympathy for John Henry. One can embrace the industrialization of agriculture and still have great sympathy for Tom Joad, right? And I think we've got to figure out in this moment, when we know the transition is coming, how to make sure that transition leaves people with dignity going forward, because this isn't a rising tide lifting all boats. This is a tsunami, and it's a tsunami that's going in the right direction, but we got to manage it. And just to the first question about what do we do with the climate denialism that's rife in the GOP, I have a real simple answer. you should treat people with 100% of the respect that they have earned. If someone shows up and says to you, "I don't believe in gravity," how, how do you respond to that? And the fact that we have a lot of colleagues who come in and say, "I don't believe in the laws of thermodynamics," it's the same thing, you know. We'll end with a song, Jared. I fought the laws of physics and the laws won. Right? You know what happens, right? So, so we just got to keep electing good, responsible people, and don't. Life's too short to waste your time with, as Gina McCarthy says, got no time for the deniers.
Yep. Well, thank you, Sean. I think those who have joined us for this conversation understand why I enjoy working with Sean Casten so much. He is brilliant and fun, and the people of Illinois are fortunate to have him in office. You can follow our progress at each of our respective websites. That's huffman.house.gov in my case, and Sean's website is Casten, CASTEN.house.gov. Please remember that we have a lot of hardworking staff that make all of our work and events like this possible. So I want to thank them and the good work they do every day. And I want to thank all of you for joining us for this conversation. Hope we can do it again.
Thank you
Take
so
care.
much, Jared. Thank you for taking the time as well, and hopefully showing off for the people of Illinois 6 why I enjoy, pinch myself, I get to work with you as well. Thank you. Be safe, everybody.
Thanks. Bye, folks.